Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Department of Studio Arts' first lecture in their spring lecture series. And I'm going to introduce to you our artist in residence, Yasi Alipour. Yasi Alipour is an Iranian artist, writer based in Brooklyn. She holds an MFA from Columbia University and is on the faculty of Rhode Island School of Design and the School of Visual Arts in New York. She's written that her tactile works explore folding as a flirtation with mathematics, as traces of time, and as an homage to the vast world of papers. In her writing, research, and pedagogical approach, Alipour focuses on intergenerational conversations that happen through and within histories of erasure. Her numerous honors and awards include a Lewis Comfort Tiffany grant and 2 Sharpe Walentas Studio Program Awards. Her work has been exhibited in the United States and abroad, including solo exhibitions at Penumbra Foundations, which I saw last year, A.I.R. Gallery, Transmitter, and PPOW, all in New York, Bavan Gallery in Tehran, and the Venice Biennale. Her writing has appeared in the Brooklyn Rail, Spot Magazine, Asia Contemporary Art Week, and Dear Dave. She was a recipient of MHZ Foundation's Critics of Color Award and awarded guest editor of the Brooklyn Rail's Critics page. Her recent featured interviews include Julie Meritou, Dorothea Rockburn, Rukrit Tiravanij, Sanford Biggers, Mark Dion, and Eliza Nissenbaum, among many others. Yasi has curated an extraordinary selection of work for our gallery for you guys to enjoy while she's here. It will blow your mind. So please join us after her talk for a reception right next door in the gallery. And please join me in welcoming Yasi Alipour.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I didn't realize I'll corner myself, but I'm back here. Geary, thank you so much. You're far too kind. And I'm really excited to share the folds in person with you soon. So can everyone hear me fine? I'm figuring out this mic. I'll get used to my echo.
Mute.
Okay, great. So I put together kind of a short-ish presentation for you. I'm really hoping to have your questions too. And thank you for being here. Also, thank you for everyone who's made me feel grounded and on the go in the past week. It's been such a joy to be in this wildly weird town. Thank you for having me. I'm learning about the 2 cafes I love, and maybe I'll find a third, but life is good. So yes, I'm going to jump right in. I've centered this presentation around teaching you 3 words in Farsi. We'll see how far I'll go with that. Don't feel pressured by it. And then, yes, please have questions for me. I love talking about my work, and I don't always make sense, so stay with me. So to get us started today, I want to focus on this image. It's an image I return to quite often. I think now it's been more than a decade of starting talks with this photo. What we're looking at is the ceiling of a mosque that is located in Isfahan. The mosque itself is located in a famous square. It's one of the most iconic works of Islamic art. The square and the mosque were built in the early years of the 1600s, and it all functions to this day. The mosque itself is one that the king made for himself, so it's kind of tiny and cozy. And where we're sitting now is kind of at the center of the mosque, and we're looking up. So this is the dome. I remember sitting there nearly 400 years after the mosque was built, and now nearly a decade ago. And I remember looking up and wondering what it meant to have this site as my history of art, and thinking about everything I had learned in school about what counted as art. and how what I was experiencing in this moment was different from all of that. The mosque itself is called Sheikh Lutfullah, and the square surrounding it is active and full of life to this day. There are people who are hanging out and singing songs and wasting time and selling craft with all the different things that word can mean. And the name of this square is Naqsh Jahan. The translation of the name of the square means marks of the world. So that will be our first word. So I want to start our presentation by thinking about the word Naqsh. Naqsh is the Farsi word for mark making. That has been something that I've been thinking about a lot these days, as what brings me back to what it means to be an artist. To get us started, I'm going to focus on 2 exhibitions that happened in the last year. And I will mostly focus on introducing my practice for you and some of the key elements in it. So, as you might have noticed, I do refer to my work as folds, and it is a pretty straightforward description. I fold paper. I always enjoy the complexity of trying to describe an act as simple as folding. I assume all of you have done it. You pick up a piece of paper. You might have done it with sheets. And the gravity kind of decides if you hold 2 points, your surface is going to fall. And then if you run your hand, your surface is going to remember a line. Then you can unfold the work. It's going to be flat again. For me, the surface has always been paper. And then without knowing it, you've already started a drawing. A line is there, and if you spend enough time, you can see the line, but the drawing remains nearly invisible. I started folding a long time ago. I'll come back to this later, but I did begin folding in middle school. And for me, this process of folding has always been mathematical. I'm always finding the edges, connecting them, and thinking about what are the different forms and shapes that my hand can figure out with the paper. But a question that became important for me with the folds is, how do I make these drawings visible? How are they seen by others? What you're seeing here is 3 different approaches that have kind of been core to my practice. One of the first answers I found in the problem of how to make my folds visible happened through a happy accident, which is a lot of what happens in my practice. I'm going to tell you my secret, and if there's any tech person, I apologize. So I started producing my own black paper. I used office printers. And if you ask the printer to print a page of black, it will use a lot of toner. And because the toner sits on top of the paper and it's placed there with heat, when I start folding, it starts taking the lines away. So all the lines and the forms you're seeing with the black paper is traces of my hand folding the paper. Now, you're going to notice that there's different scales when it comes to this paper. I liked using tabloid paper, and then I pieced them together with archival tape. And then with that, you can have any scale that you want. I did that for a long time, and it was really interesting to think what it shows and how it follows the movement of my hand. My second approach to, or the second answer, became cyanotypes. Now, some of you might be familiar with the process of cyanotypes, and to me, it's really exciting that it's a process that is very accessible and easy to realize. It's 2 different liquids. You can buy it at any art supply store. You mix them, and the mixture is light sensitive. So with that, you can cover any surface. It could be textile, it could be paper, and through that, the paper is already light sensitive. The way I approach it is, after coating the paper, I begin folding. And folding is always a 3-dimensional process. You can never fold any surface, especially paper, without picking it up from the table. So then they turn into sculptural forms, and the exhibition currently has a lot of those. Things got very 3-dimensional. But the folds themselves are always within moments of being 3-dimensional and then unfolded and becoming flat again. And because the paper is light sensitive, I leave it in the sun after folding it. I usually leave it for a whole day, like sunrise to sunset. And these sculptures begins to cast shadows on itself. So for the rest of the presentation and in the show, whenever you see any of the blueprints, they are the cyanotypes. And all the lights, all the traces and all the different shadows you see there, it's all decided by what the paper itself casts on itself as a moment of being sculptured. Then to develop cyanotypes, you put it back in water, you use hydrogen peroxide, and then it becomes fixed. So after that, it remains the same. So usually, what you're seeing is an image, an installation shot from the exhibition at Penumbra Foundation. Usually when it comes to having the shows, I look back at the works that happened mostly in the past year or so. And I've been showing them as a combination. And I start to try to understand what are the questions that have been coming up at this time. Something that was important at the Penumbra exhibition and has remained important, it's almost felt like it coming back. So within the exhibition in the last couple of years, I've returned to where folding began with me. These days I work a lot with paper itself and thinking about allowing that nearly invisible drawing to be seen, to be read. Now sometimes I approach it by creating slight moments of three-dimensionality, and sometimes they become nearly visible because of the depth and the texture of the paper, and sometimes it's literally the amount of lines that makes them visible. So these are some of the core elements to how folding works for me. I'll get into more details, but before I do that, I want to return to this exhibition that I was in last year. And while I show you some images from that exhibition, I'm going to read you something I wrote a few years ago about the practice of folding. The writing is short, and it happened alongside an exhibition in Iran, which I'm going to talk about later. So it's part of a bilingual text, but I'm going to leave you with the English version for today. And it's the closest I can get to describe what folding has meant for me. Fold. A child board in the back of a classroom. A drawing disguised as a math exercise. Eyes mesmerized by the curves. Lines flirting with infinity. A hand not trusting rulers or their measuring nonsense. A hand failing all but touch itself. Did I tell you? Our word for math is labor. Hell with your divide, bodies are present and invisible. Count. It's a system, a score, and we dance. Did she say here, there, and elsewhere? Over the years, paper got used to pretending to be a rectangle. The edges giggle, as if they would ever believe in something as silly as parallels. I bring the far ends together. My fingers run to touch, to bend, to trace, to remember. I count through forgetting. The lines are threads I lose and find again. Cycle. It's a sea you haven't seen. In actuality, it's just a lake that grew too big. And so one day, it decided to be called a sea. Sometimes it can be as simple as that. Sometimes sitting in New York, staring at the Atlantic, I call it an ocean. How can a story ask you to imagine, to believe into existence, what you will never see? I no longer trust language. The paper is coated as if waiting for the sun. Blue, the deeper you go, the more you have known the warmth on your skin. Distance. There was no verbs this time, only traces through and through. It's memories of stories in languages you don't know. Silence. It's an empty page and my hand. Okay, so now for our second part of the talk, I want to introduce the second word for you. So as I mentioned, the first word was naqsh, which means mark making, and the second word is related to the first word, and it's naqashi. Naqash is the only word we use in Farsi for the medium of painting. And as you can notice within the similarity of the two words, it is rooted in the idea of mark making. These days, I think a lot about what it means to relate to a medium through this word. What if painting itself can be an emphasis in the act of mark making? So here, as I go through some of the some other shows from the last couple of years, what I want to focus on are two specific elements in my work. So while I've been folding and the work has been changing and taking its own turns, two things have remained consistent in my work. One has been mathematics and the other one is paper. So first, I kind of wanted to introduce to you what I mean by mathematics. On some level, it's fairly simple. For me, the process of folding is algorithmic. I kind of know my moves before going in. There's a lot of questions that relate to geometry. For example, if the paper is a rectangle, how do I make a square? And then I continue with these questions, and they always keep me going. And when I say mathematical, it's also a fun challenge for myself. It is really important for me to emphasize I don't use any tools for measurement. So there's no rulers in any of the works. There's no compasses. It is whatever math my hand can figure out with the paper. So for today's presentation, I was very excited to find this image that can bring me all the way back. So as I mentioned, for me, folding began in middle school. The diagram you see on the other side, the small diagram, is an exercise we had back in Iran in our middle school textbooks. And it is a mathematical drawing. So it was in our math books. And it's a very simple algorithm. So you draw two lines, and then you divide each of them to 10 or more, and then you start connecting the lines. And then before you know it, through only straight lines, you begin to have these curves. Now, as a kid, that blew my mind. And as someone who loves repetition and loved repetition for a long time, as I began doing it and really enjoying it, I wanted it more detailed, because the bigger the number of lines, the more beautiful your curve is. So first it was every centimeter, and then it was every half a centimeter, and then it was a quarter, and then I wanted to be 1 millimeter. And it had to be correct, and erasers weren't working, and I'm a very sloppy person when it comes to actually using tools. And I couldn't even see the lines in between anymore. And I remember folding this form. I remember knowing that I trusted my hand more than the ruler. And I knew that with folding, I could realize it in as detailed as a process as I wanted. I also knew that if I sit in the back of the classroom and make drawings with folds, no teacher can get mad at me, because technically I'm not doodling, I'm just touching paper. They did get mad at me. And then these forms kind of repeat and continue to this day. If you might notice it, you might not. If you pay attention, the piece I have here is from the exhibition from a couple of years ago. So the piece itself is from 2022. And if you look at what's around it, like the four edges, it is the exact same algorithm as that early exercise repeating here. So to this day, sometimes when I need a curve, especially if I'm looking for a circle, a very simple way of doing it is repeating the exact same algorithm. So I'd be curious if it's legible at all. It's a question I always have with my work. And then many years later, and kind of by accident, I did study computer science. I have a bachelor in computer science, which mostly taught me that I don't like debugging, so I don't enjoy coding. But I liked logic. I liked, and it was in the math department, so it was like pure logic, as much as I don't trust the word pure. And what I enjoyed about it is that so much of it is about world building. So if any of you have ever had courses on logic, you can have 3 or 4 rules. You have your propositions, so you say things are true or false, and you don't negotiate your propositions. Those are just the word world building. And then within those 4 rules, you can play around. You can prove certain things. You can solve problems. And then you can change your rules. You can take one away, change one, or add something. And as simple as that, then you have a different world. And then you can play there, and you can find more reasons to play. For me, folding has that to this day. A lot of how folding works for me is that kind of playing. The difference is I left that program very much interested in the problem of paradoxes. When I say interested, it was a thesis I was writing, and it was focused on this specific paradox. And I was also hanging out with the theater kids and taking photos. So there were moments that paradoxes were part of our daily life. We were the glitch in the system. And then I was dealing with these old European philosophers that were trying to create languages where we couldn't imagine paradoxes. That part of institutional mathematics never made sense to me. So for me, what I say is mathematical in my work is very much embodied. So part of it is literally related to desire. I enjoy folding. I like counting. I like being able to create new numbers. In the past year, I figured out how to fold things to 7, which doesn't do anything for anyone other than it changed everything for me. But it's also about labor. It's about how much your hand can figure out. It's also about many different kinds of histories. As someone who has a bachelor in a math department, and for me that was in the University of Tehran, I'm very aware that in that space, logic and mathematics was something that they discussed as if it had never been embodied, that what was at stake wasn't people doing work and figuring things out, and they were very comfortable using words like pure. And for me, there was something that my hands could figure out that my language couldn't. To this day, I have some friends who did become proper computer scientists and mathematicians, and every once in a while, I grab a fold, I run to them, and I'm like, why does this happen? A few of them tolerate me doing that. So for the second part of this section, I want to focus on paper. Now, that's something that I wanted to kind of pay attention to throughout the presentation and as we go to see the show. But paper has been the other consistent in my work. On some level, it's very much related to the mathematical question. It's kind of delightful that paper gets very close to mathematical definitions. Like if you're looking for something that is two-dimensional, more than a line drawn, the surface of the paper can be that space of two-dimensionality. And then if the surface is two-dimensional, then a fold is a line that can be close to the one-dimensional. I love playing with those things. The same things continue as I think about, like, how do I create a triangle? So paper started in that space, but paper was also what was accessible. Something that has, for me, been very meaningful is paper was around, and paper is what I can find at any moment in any place. I always have a bunch of notebooks and books that are filled with tiny folds that happen in the in-between moments. And as different as they are, they can carry the process of folding continuously. I used to love to fold during talks and lectures, and I now do love folding on trains and while commuting. It also reminds me of everyone in my life that had practices that was related to their hands being busy. Sometimes I think about, like, my mom on the phone doodling, or my auntie breaking matchsticks. So in paper being accessible, it's also that desire and relation with the hand. But the other part of what is interesting about paper is that as a material, it's incredibly stubborn. It has memory, it is resilient, it can go through so much pressure and then it can break at a second. It doesn't listen. It responds to the space surrounding it. It recalls how it was held before. So it has actively been dancing and pushing with me. And then something that has been quite significant, and I must say it has grown a lot in the last couple of years, is to think about the paper as a history, as a trace of different histories of paper making. Something that became quite significant has been the desire to remember and know the name of different practices of paper making. I studied, a lot of my education in visual art happened to be in this country, and quite often we use generalized and false terms to refer to paper that comes from different cultures. And these days I try to learn the names to understand the different practices. With cyanotypes, things change a lot because I started working with handmade paper, and handmade paper really has the presence of someone else making it, especially while the cyanotypes push the paper itself. I can feel the fibers moving. You get to know how they're woven. You get to feel how long they are. So a lot of the folds you're seeing here, the papers explored, are East Asian paper. There's a lot of Japanese paper, some Korean paper. And more, I think about what are the interrelations, what are the histories of paper making that I can still reach while I search on my computer sitting in New York. So with these two sections and trying to wrap up this whole part, I wanted to bring you to an exhibition that happened a couple of years ago, and I mentioned it earlier on. A few years ago, I had the chance to have a solo exhibition in Iran. And it was an important moment to me. And I've been thinking a lot about what about it was significant. Now, of course, there was being able to hang out with friends from back in the days and be in my mother tongue while discussing the work. But there was something more that was happening in this space. I think one of the things that was vastly different was even thinking about the space surrounding us. I began noticing that a lot of the discussion I have about geometry and abstraction in a city like Tehran is vastly different. And not only because we're surrounded by the historic sites that I mentioned earlier on, but even the ugly looking buildings in the 80s and the logos that are on the national TV, the forms and patterns repeat everywhere. So in our small talks during an opening, people are very much used to discussing abstraction on a level that is very different from what I have experienced here. The other thing that felt important and it feels related is some of the negations and separations that happen sometimes when I'm discussing my work here simply didn't exist. It didn't feel necessary to discuss how contemporary abstraction relates to this long history. There was a lot that we didn't need to explain in language anymore. A moment that happened during this show, though, that I think about a lot is, I think one of the things that kind of made me an outsider artist within this space was actually my relationship with paper. I often like making works in the space that I'm going to show the work. I had the chance to do this here because this city has really good sun. But I often think about about getting paper in the space I'm in. So as I was going to Iran, I started asking around about finding paper within the country. And what had happened is, partially because of the sanctions and many other elements of what our recent history is, almost all the artists and the gallery, people often told me to bring the paper. It has been fairly hard to find paper as artists within the country. So I brought a suitcase full of East Asian paper I bought in New York to get on a flight and come back and be in Iran and wonder when and how and why these interrelations within the continent have been interrupted. I say all of this, but I also want to emphasize the thing that was incredible about having this show is I got the chance to finish the work while surrounded by my family and loved ones. This is something that happens with my folds quite often because they require a lot of time and attention. So I ended up watching a lot of TV with my cousin and folding. And I do think about it as the work gets more and more laborious, that it can carry these stories and these moments we spend together without using any language. Perhaps the final most important thing that happened in this show is that I had a chance to have my grandmother see my work. Now, my grandmother was a working class woman. She did not worry about what contemporary art means or how it relates to different histories of art. She also liked calling me an engineer because computer scientists in Iran are not engineers, and she liked being sassy. But she went to see the show, and she called me, and she was like, Yasi, I have no idea what you're doing. But she got the algorithm. So when I started talking to her about the process of making things, then we were leaning in. And in that moment, I was reminded that she was a weaver. So as unique as I sometimes might think my work is, she very deeply understood how the relationship between the repetitive gesture and creating these different textures can feel similar to coding and having a algorithm. So with this, and I promise we're getting there, I want to bring you to the third word. So we talked about naqsh, which is mark making, and we talked about naqashi, which is the word for painting. And the third word I want to introduce to you is naqsh. Naqsh is the Farsi word for mapping. Now, it's been very exciting because I'm someone who loves maps, if it's not obvious. But I do also want us to think together, what would it mean to think about what maps can be if we think of them in relationship to painting and mark making. This is, must confess, things I find on Instagram, but this is an Ottoman map. So I'm really drawn to what are the other different ways we have found pathways to create, to imagine the space and our movement. So in this moment, I want to share with you some of my recent questions. So I have images of some recent work. Most of them are in the show. I think not all of them are in the show. So I think the one that is not in the show is in the studio. So if you're interested, it is around. And I wanted to share with you some of the questions that I carry these days specifically. So for the first one, I do want to return and think about maps. Sometimes I think about maps as a desire. I don't know why. I don't know why I've always been drawn to them. But I'm very familiar with that desire to map things, to measure, to trace as a way of understanding space. But something I think about a lot is, how can we think about map making as people who move within a space, not as those who are imagining an other, an elsewhere space that can be conquered. And if we're thinking about mapping as people who are moving through a space, then can mapping become a way of getting lost? The other thing I think about a lot these days, and it feels very related, is the relationship between paper and textile. I'm kind of curious about how one ends and the other begins and all the in-betweens. As Jerry very kindly mentioned, I do teach at RISD, and I had the chance to work with a lot of, I teach in the painting department, and I had the chance to work with a lot of textile students. And if y'all don't know Rhode Island School of Design, they're very nerdy about craft and making things. So the textile students were very involved. And it was really interesting to think about our conversations, and what was really moving to me was, in many ways, creating textile is also algorithmic. And they also think about mapping all the time, from imagining what the textile is to the moment of realizing it and finishing the work. But something that they brought up that has inspired me a lot in the last couple of months is, a lot of them, when they talk about mapping, they think about moving within spaces. all of this to say, and I'll come back to this. Maybe I'll come back to this, or you can ask me more. These days I think a lot about the Silk Road and the history of paper. A lot of the paper I work with is mulberry paper, and mulberry paper is also the same tree where silkworms exist. So it is related to textile in this very specific and intimate way, but it's also related to a history of mark making and art that connects East Asia to the Middle East and North Africa. It's been really moving for me to imagine the conversations that can exist within these spaces. For this one, alongside asking all these questions and being with my art kids, a mentor of mine recommended this book about a mathematician. And it's been really fun reading about a mathematician. Now, before that, I was really stuck with some grumpy mathematicians. I was really stuck with paradoxes in different languages of math, and I kind of became very interested in the anxiety and the gravity of mathematicians who started thinking about incompleteness in math, which for me is really exciting because it means I can fold forever. At least that's what I tell myself. But then I started reading this book about Erdos, who is a numerologist. Numerologists are kind of silly, and they do weird things, and they don't feel as heavy as a lot of logicians do. And something I picked up that literally inspired this work is a lot of them are interested in the number 28. There's nothing significant about the number 28 other than if you add the factors, they add up to 28 again. So 1, 2, 4, 7, 14. If you add those, it becomes 28 again. And then the numerologists are very entertained by that. It just happened to be that this happened during the year where I was folding a lot of 7s. So this one is all folds based on 28s. Now, can anyone else read it? Definitely not, but it kept me busy. So Erdos and numerologists have been playful mathematicians that have kept me going. And perhaps one of the most important questions that I've been sitting with in the last year, and definitely influenced the exhibition that we're going to get to see together, has been the question of what makes a fold visible, and what does it mean to stay with these moments that are closer to invisibility. So within that, as I very intentionally went back and focused on working with the paper itself without any of these other processes, I kind of became interested in how what I was exploring with the black paper and what I was learning from the cyanotypes could also be realized within the paper itself. So if within the black paper things become visible by the density of the lines, then the same can be seen within the paper. If you fold it enough, then there's a moment where the texture of the paper changes. And then the rest of it is trusting that the viewers will spend enough time to see that shift. And if cyanotypes become visible because at some point they were nearly three-dimensional and precarious sculptures, and they casted shadows on themselves, then the paper itself, the same can be done. If it becomes slightly three-dimensional, then it's going to cast shadows on itself. And then with that in itself, it begins to become legible, or I hope so. And then this is my last slide. And this always happens with my work. I was very busy seriously thinking about all these things, and then the folds took a different turn. Things became wiggly in a way that I didn't expect. I kind of returned to this form I knew for a long time, and I was hanging out with one of my math-heavy friends I've known from my college years, and I became really interested. It's a very simple structure, and before you know it, it's diamonds and it's straight lines, and if you fold it in, it starts becoming these structures that are very strong. My mathematician friend was also very helpful in inspiring me to have longer paper. That has also changed everything. So I'm going to end it here, because if folding has continued over all these years, it's definitely because of all the times it doesn't listen to me. So with that, I'm going to pause I would love to have questions and hear from all of you. And then we have a whole show of folds that are waiting for you. So thank you so much. Thank you for having me. You decide. I'm not going to decide. Yes.
Would you talk a little bit more about cultural differences surrounding the idea of abstraction?
So the question was, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I can discuss the cultural differences in how we think about abstraction. To me it's really interesting because obviously all these terms also exist in Farsi, and things have been translated, and like the same discussions that happen here happen in Iran in very different ways. But I think for me it's really interesting to think, what does it mean to have a long history and legacy of art making that has continuously dealt with abstraction? Or the other way of it is, I think for a long time and through a lot of my education in arts, I kind of understood a lot of times the way I was taught history of art in the context similar to the Middle East was through a lack, that there hasn't been this relation to figuration. And then it's been really liberating to think, is it a lack or a difference? And then to me, it's really exciting. It's like, I'm very lucky too. I just have never been that interested in figuration. And to me, it's really interesting because sometimes in English, I feel like people use the word figuration, representation interchangeably. And to me, they're so vastly different. So I'm really interested in what it means for things to be embodied, but not about images of the body, you know? And then within that, I played. I think for me as an artist, it has been about finding ways, like what gives me the courage to make the work, or what gives me permission to make the work, and then knowing that there's this long history that can inspire me. And of course, a lot of really significant contemporary artists, like some of those that I had the chance to interview. And then I think as a teacher, it's been really interesting to me to know that we have classrooms of people who come from many different histories of abstraction. And with that, it becomes to me, a much deeper question of what mark making can mean. I don't know if that answers it, but yeah. You had a question? Was someone else had a question in that corner?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it can be a follow-up question
Sure.
to that, because your talk really resonated with me, especially my research on the relation or the challenging the separation between the manual and intellectual labor.
Mm-hmm.
And the embodiment is very much there, and I would even say like it's a very much entanglement with your body, your environment, and your material, and you are actually giving agency to all these different agents surrounding you. And I was wondering if we assume that this canonical separation between intellect and the body is a Western construct. What are the microcosmic agents that inform your philosophy or your work?
Your research sounds really exciting. I would love to learn more. I have no idea how to repeat that question, but thank you. I got worried that I'm going to be asked to repeat it, but I don't think I was. So basically, it's hard. It's hard. I mean, but this is how I think about it. So I got my first bachelor at the University of Tehran, and I was in the math department. And I remember we had kind of a long poster, and it was about the history of mathematics, right? And it's a post-revolutionary country with a lot of, but because of that, it wasn't just Western, but a lot of non-Western was like back in the day, you know? It was like ancient on some level. I think it was almost certain, well, I wonder. It was, for the least, majority male, like vast majority, right? And then it kind of ended with Russell or something. It was like around there. That's also the paradox I was working on, was the liar's paradox. And then it was really interesting because I feel like a lot of what that structure teaches you, like a space like I was in the science department, and through the science department, I was in the math department. And it was kind of taken for granted that it's like these things are separate, right? It's like the idea of the mind, body, self, other, like all of it is seen as like, it's just like the ground you stand on. And then as I mentioned, I loved hanging out with the theater kids. I was taking photos of really bad plays, and the worse the play, the better the photos. And it was a lot of fun. And then it was like the body was like on the line. We're also protesting. It's like the body was present, like we were together. Like the same people that I'm like, was hanging out with my old day mathematician friend. It's like, those were the people I was on the streets with, you know? So then these days I do think about it a lot. I'm like, isn't it amazing that I've had access and like the presence of figures in my life, like in the everyday. Like as long as I remember, we knew about mathematicians who were poets, and poets who were architects, and architects who were craftsmen, you know, that I knew those interrelations. And at the same time, I mean, my mom is a math teacher. So a lot of like the ways I learned math, it was like through her storytelling. She loved giving really weird math problems to very small people. I was like, we would like be crossing the street and she would be like, what is the shortest path, you know? And but she also cared a lot about this question of like mathematics as thinking and imagining in a way that has a complicated relationship with the body. She was so anxious about people learning how to count by their hand. This is like my earliest memories, you know? So the way I think about it, and I think it also relates to the question of embodiment and labor, because it's also about whose labor valuing, you know? And when is the point that we start valuing the labor? Which is why I'm also really drawn to that ceiling, you know? Because I definitely stay because I feel the hands present. But that labor is also not named. It's not, I don't know who the maker is. Yeah, so it's like those are questions I carry a lot, and it's like I've been very lucky to have like a community of artists and thinkers and scientists that also carry these questions in the everyday. But it runs deep, especially in fields like mathematics, because I feel like as far as I understand it, and hopefully and perhaps it's changing, it's not that critical of its own history, and it has a very specific kind of history. Hi.
Hey, thank you. I was really curious about titles, because there's so many poetic statements or descriptions that exist in all of these pieces, and I was kind of curious, like, does the title come out before or during your process or after it, or is it in Farsi? Is it in English? Does it go both? You know, like I was just kind of curious, like how that comes about and how.
Yeah, I feel seen, but also like clocked. The titles definitely happen after, especially with the show. I'm like, yeah, it happens after the install is done, and I'm like, okay, wait, it's title time? But as someone who loves writing, and you know, it's like my training in writing came from like art publications. I had editors. I'm very grateful for that. I also love writing in English because I don't care about English the way I care about Farsi. I can like play around. But it was very structured. And then I have kind of my poetic writing that are like kind of the thoughts that carry me. And I think titles have been some of those moments where it's like I can kind of ground. Like I have to kind of find a system at the time. I'm like, oh, these are some of the thoughts. And then it kind of becomes a trace of like, oh, in that time, these were some of the questions. It's also slightly a nightmare because people refer to my work with the titles, and I'm like, I have no idea what work that is. And then people have a tendency to confuse my work with each other. I'm like, now we're all, but it's a weird archive. But a long time ago, I used to think about it because at some point I had mentors who were recommending that I title things with numbers. I'm like, numbers are not that casual for me. Like, I wouldn't, like, it would get complicated. Yeah, so. Yes.
Hi, thanks, Yasi. I will stay with the titles actually, because there was one in there that I hadn't seen the title of before, and it was "Ah," which translates to "ouch," and it made me think of what you were saying about the paper and its own kind of almost having its own agency, its own decision to make, its vulnerability. But also, I was really hoping to hear you speak maybe a bit more about that moment of breaking, as you were saying, especially as you were thinking about the continuities. I felt so if you had anything to expand there. But also I was wondering with the folds themselves, how you maybe think about their temporalities and their spatial, like the space. I started by thinking about this in terms of space. Are folds creating insides or outsides or both? Or do you ever think of them in that context? And I don't want to stick you with a binary, but just thinking of it like, because I know you also do logic and a lot of philosophy, and there are all these arguments around folds. So I don't know if you engage with it in that term, in those terms, but also, I mean, I know that you think of folds as movement. So that also, again, brings you back to the, what is their temporality? What is their, so anything you can expand on. Thanks again, please.
Thank you for being here.
Who is that?
That is Sarah. We have been collaborating and in conversation for a long time. I mean, she is incredible at reading work, but just so you know, I planted Sarah in the audience. You know, "ah" is also interesting because it does translate to "ouch," but to me it's more. But I also remember my parents were visiting me, and my mom fell, and she has like broken English. They live in Iran. And she said, "ouch." I was like, why are you translating your pain sound? Like, nothing had felt weirder. I was like, say "oh," you know? But it's also like, I don't know, in every like emotional thing in Iran gets so deep, you know? But the titling are moments for me to kind of think about some of those things. Being like, oh, I don't know how to translate that. So sometimes it can be incredibly silly and incredibly serious at the same time. But something that Sarah mentioned, and I wanted to mention, especially when I was talking about the work in Iran, the paper tears, especially because I make a lot of folds. And that was kind of a moment where my practice changed radically. It used to be that it's like if something tore, I was done. It just failed. It was like the one thing I couldn't deal with. And then I learned how to mend and fix my paper. I just use archival adhesive and use fibers, and then they get fixed. And if you pay attention, almost all of them have moments of tearing. It also taught me a lot about what paper is. Because the more I've worked with paper, I'm like, oh, it is, a lot of the paper I've worked with is for fixing manuscripts. So it's like for repair. So it's like already has this relationship to mending and repairing. But what I was going to say is I remember I was folding a bigger piece. I was hanging out with my cousin. We're watching TV. And it's like always this very dramatic sound. It's like a week with him doing the work, and then it just like tore. And when it tears, it's like all the tension of all the time. It just kind of like runs through its own lines. And like I remember her gasping. She was like, I was like, it's fine. I'll fix it. And sometimes it happens in the studio and I gasp. Like this dramatic thing happened. And it's interesting because I think a lot of the process of paper and folding is like kind of, it can be so quiet and so close to whispers, but it's also so much about like the tension. It's like continuous pressure. So there's a moment where paper is like, absolutely not, I'm done. And then I'm always negotiating with paper. When it comes to, I mean, the question you asked is like profound and it will haunt me for a while. But what I would say, the thing that to me is really interesting, so I love using paper that is very thin, mostly because those papers are also almost stronger. Like for me, tracing papers were some early points of reference, but also because that's on the mathematical front, I'm like, this is very close to something that is two-dimensional. It's like as an object, it barely exists. Like, I've worked with the kind of paper that if you breathe around it, it's just like vanishes. And then it can tolerate so many folds. And then the lines are visible. But throughout, something that has been interesting for me, so when you fold paper and you start your drawing through folding, the line is neither in the front or the back of the paper, the line is within the paper. So even when I make the black paper, I print it double-sided, even though no one sees the back. Because I'm like, the fold itself stands within. And that's why the paper remembers it too. And I'm really interested in that within that is almost nothing. It's like, I don't know where the materiality of paper happens. So it's like that's maybe one of the things I'm thinking about. And then maybe I can wrap up my thoughts on that one here. I used to fold in halves for a really long time. So like I think it's been like 10 years of having other numbers, less, like 8 years. But before that, everything I made was like folding things in halves. Like you connect the edge, you score it, then you have folded something in halves. So everything was like dealing with symmetry in very specific ways. And then a couple of years ago, I figured out how to fold things in a third. And that to me was a game changer, you know? Because then I could understand different relations, I could have different forms. But I do still think about it, that the first gesture I always have is like a line, and that in itself divides something. Like that in itself is creating some border, or perhaps like, creating a two. But then I stop making sense. If people want follow up on that, I'm here. Anyone else? All the way in the back, and then we'll come here.
Thank you for your talk.
Of course, thank you.
I really, as a computer science and art major, I really appreciate both sort of your thinking about algorithms and also your respect for manual labor and handcraft. And I'm wondering if you could comment on generative art, both traditional or maybe this newer AI stuff, and what the place of that is, or if there's a place for that.
I think there's this place for everything. But that's a good question. I'll approach it this way. A few years ago, someone I really didn't know, it was like some grad student somewhere, was walking by. We were like hanging out with some artists. And he was like, "You're a computer artist." I was like, "Sure." You know? And Rickard was in the audience, and he was like, "Yasi, what is sure?" I was like, "I don't know. I compute on some level. But I can't fold the screen." Because people used to just also ask me, it's like, "Would you do this digitally?" And I'm like, "I cannot fold the screen. It will break." It's like, I need to do things with my hand. One time, I used to love scanning them, and then the computer gets confused and frustrated. And then I get, because it's not following the right lines, and it's so much labor, it gets exhausted. And for me, it is so much about that play and the time. With the generative stuff, my sister, who's not the computer scientist in the family, she's a doctor, and she's currently really excited about reading about AI and ethics of it and our relations with it. I'm in denial. I'm like, my plan is to not survive. Very actively. Now I've said it and it's been recorded, but it is my plan. But she turned to me one day and she was so excited. She was like, "Yasi, when AI takes over, they're gonna like your art. Because it's kind of legible to computers, but they can appreciate you doing it by hand because it has errors, you know?" She was like, "They're gonna like it." I was like, am I just like producing this for them? I was like, I don't know what's happening in your brain. But yeah, I like things that are slow, you know? And sometimes I wonder if these devices are also tired of us. We make a lot of demands. But yeah, I don't know if that answers anything, but yeah.
One more question?
Sure, yeah, and someone around there had a question.
I was curious if you could speak more about your process of mapping, like it was intuitive, based off of your like titles. Sometimes it felt like you were trying to like other question is, how do you store these pieces?
That I have answers for, and I believe in it, but I'll come back to that one. That one is easy and makes me very happy. So for me, the answer is in two parts, and I'm really glad that you asked about like how intuition plays with it, because on some level, I know my moves before I start folding. So I know the lines that are going to be made. So it's like, for example, I'm going to have 3 squares, and each square will be divided like 6 by 6. And then I'm going to see what's going to happen. And then doing that, and then for a while, usually it makes me happy. But then through doing that, I'm like, what happens if I change like one variable? So what happens if it's more detailed? What happens if it's bigger? What happens if it's smaller? But then there's a point where I start getting bored by the question, and I'm like, what happens if I only have the parallel lines and not the horizontal lines? And then it becomes something different. So I usually know my moves, but the thing is I will never know what they'll look like until I do it. So I have no image in my mind. Like when I start the fold, it's like almost like an algorithm I could write. And then I have to do it, and then from there I learn, and you kind of create a different like problem for yourself. And to me, it's been really interesting to think about things like intuition within these relations and world building. And I think, as someone who's very talkative, for me, folding is so much about spending time. And it's about moments where my hand is smarter than my brain, but I'm capable of losing language. Like I don't know the answers, but they also carry all the questions that existed within that time, like continuously. And when I say within that time, it can be like something someone posts, somewhere I go, some conversation I have with someone, some profound talk, being bored on the train. And I think the titles kind of become a place to try to capture some of that. So it's like some of the, especially in relationship to mapping, because what I'm aware of is that desire for mapping. And then the rest of it, I'm like, but what do I want from it? And then a few years ago, like I remember, and this really influenced me, there was this controversy within the Iranian community because different places were drawing the map of the country, and the map usually includes some of the Caspian Sea, and then it has like lines, like a political line of where it's cut off. And people had changed that, and then it freaked people out, right? And I'm like, what is a border within a body of water? And now, of course, that is also, that body of water is where my family's from, where I grew up with, like, it's the sands I know, it's the sea I recognize, and then it's like a lot of other things around it. But as someone who's interested in maps, I was like, how am I even reading this? Like, what does it mean to try to understand what's happening here? And then folding continues. I like folding, and I'm very grateful. Like, it still blows my mind that I got away with it. I'm like, this is my life. Like, I wake up, I'm like, I'm gonna go to my studio and watch TV and fold, you know? It's like my problems include like what show is long enough to finish like a really detailed. It's true. And that is actively a problem right now because I'm doing a lot of folding and I need a couple of seasons of something. But so then the folds will continuously happen regardless of what I'm worried about, like what I'm wondering about. And then, yeah, it's like, I think the titling is hard and moving for me because like I have to find language again, but in a way to not silence the work. And then the funny thing is like, I was putting the talk together for today, and it's such a gift to be able to give a talk and then be like, let's go see the show. But I was like, my folds are always like this. I think I know what I'm doing, and then they kind of mock me. It just absolutely changes. It's like, I was telling Jerry, like, I've been thinking a lot about painting, and then suddenly everything became sculpture. They don't care, you know? Like, my hand runs away, and then the moment my brain can catch up and find language with it, then my hand is bored by that and is doing something else. So I kind of have to listen to what they're doing too. I don't know if that answers anything. Okay.
Yasi, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for staying, for coming, for being here. Thank you. Great joy.